Before agriculture changed human life, finding food was part of everyday survival. A meal could begin with whatever edible plants, roots, fruits, seeds, or animals were available nearby. Unlike modern supermarkets, there was no fixed menu waiting for them. People had to search their surroundings and recognize which natural foods were available at that particular time and place. Roots and tubers could provide valuable energy because they stored carbohydrates underground. Finding them required knowledge of plants, seasons, and exactly where to dig. Wild fruits and berries could add sweetness and nutrients to the diet, but their availability depended strongly on local climate and season. Nuts and seeds were another possible source of concentrated energy. Small foods could be easy to overlook today, but for hunter-gatherers many different resources could contribute to a meal. The important point is that prehistoric diets were not fixed. What people ate could change from one season to another as fruits disappeared, plants matured, animals moved, and new resources became available. When nearby resources were not enough, groups could travel farther from their shelter. Their food choices were therefore closely connected to the landscape surrounding them. But plant foods were only part of the story. Animal foods could also become important, especially when people encountered useful hunting opportunities in their environment. Hunting required very different skills from gathering. Hunters had to understand animal behavior, read tracks, move quietly, and decide when an opportunity was worth pursuing. So what did ancient humans eat? There is no single answer. Their diets were shaped by geography, season, climate, technology, and whatever resources they could successfully obtain. When a group decided to hunt, success was never guaranteed. A large animal could provide a great deal of food, but approaching it required patience, coordination, and considerable risk. Tracks could reveal which animals had passed through an area and how recently they had been there. Reading these signs turned the landscape itself into a source of information. Hunters also had to work together. Moving as a group could improve their chances of approaching an animal while reducing the risk of losing sight of one another. The group would also need to choose carefully. Attacking the wrong animal could waste valuable energy or expose the hunters to unnecessary danger. If the hunt turned into a chase, speed alone was not enough. The hunters had to manage their energy while keeping the animal moving in a direction that gave them a realistic opportunity. Large prey animals were not passive sources of food. They could be extremely dangerous, which meant that a failed hunt could have serious consequences for the people attempting it. When a hunt succeeded, the reward could be substantial. A single large animal could provide meat and other useful resources, making the effort worthwhile for an entire group. Getting food was only the beginning. Once an animal had been obtained, the group still had to process it, transport useful portions, and make sure as little valuable food as possible was wasted. Stone tools made it possible to cut meat from the carcass and separate useful parts. Archaeological sites contain stone tools and animal bones with marks that provide evidence for these kinds of activities. Meat was not necessarily the only valuable part. Large bones could also contain nutrient-rich marrow, giving people another reason to process the carcass carefully rather than simply taking the obvious pieces of meat. Large bones could be deliberately broken to reach the marrow inside. This fatty tissue was an energy-rich food, and evidence of deliberately broken animal bones is one reason archaeologists pay close attention to marrow extraction. Marrow was very different from lean muscle meat. It contained a high concentration of fat, making it especially valuable when other sources of energy were limited. Stone tools were not just weapons. They were practical cutting and processing tools that helped turn an animal carcass into food and usable materials. An animal could provide much more than meat. Its hide, bones, sinew, and other tissues could also be useful, making a successful hunt an important event for the entire group. Animals were not the only source of food. Rivers, lakes, and coastlines could provide completely different resources, especially for groups living close to water. Fishing methods could be simple or sophisticated depending on the place and period. A river could become a reliable source of food when people understood where fish gathered and how the water moved. Aquatic foods could add another source of protein and fat to the diet. But again, their importance depended on geography, people living far from water would have had very different opportunities. The landscape therefore acted almost like a giant pantry. What people could eat depended on what animals, plants, water sources, and seasonal resources existed around them. Move the same kind of human group into a colder environment, however, and the available menu could change dramatically. Plants became less abundant during parts of the year, while large animals could become especially important. This is why it is misleading to imagine that all ancient humans followed the same diet. Their food choices were shaped by the environment they had to survive in. In warmer and more heavily wooded environments, plants could offer a much wider range of foods. The exact combination depended on which species grew naturally in that region. Gathering plants was not simply a matter of picking anything green. Knowledge of which plants were edible, when they were available, and where they grew could be extremely important. Even foods that seemed simple could require considerable work. Hard nuts had to be gathered, transported, opened, and processed before their edible contents could be consumed. Honey was another possible source of concentrated energy where wild bee colonies were available. Reaching it, however, meant dealing with the insects protecting the nest. A prehistoric meal did not need to come from one giant food source. Many small resources gathered over time could be combined to make a meaningful contribution to the group's diet. In some environments, insects could also provide protein and fat. Their importance would vary greatly depending on local species, season, and cultural knowledge. Bird eggs could provide another occasional food source. Finding them depended on knowing where birds nested and when those nests were likely to contain eggs. Food gathering also involved knowledge passed between generations. Knowing what could be eaten, where it grew, and when it appeared was part of surviving in a natural environment. Then there was fire. Once people learned to control and use it effectively, heat could change the texture, taste, and digestibility of many foods. Cooking could soften tough foods and make some resources easier to chew and digest. But exactly when and how different prehistoric groups used fire varied across time and place. Around the fire, different foods could be processed together. Roots might be softened by heat while meat could be exposed to the flames, creating a very different meal from the raw foods gathered earlier. Fire was more than a way to keep warm. It was a technology that could transform food and make parts of the environment more useful to humans. Food was also social. A successful hunt or a productive gathering could provide resources that were shared among several members of a group rather than consumed by one person alone. Unlike modern people, prehistoric groups had no refrigerator waiting at the end of the day. Fresh food therefore had to be eaten, processed, or preserved using whatever natural methods their environment and technology allowed. In suitable conditions, drying could help remove moisture from food and potentially extend its usable life. Preservation methods, however, would have depended heavily on climate and local knowledge. Not every season was equally generous. There could be periods when fruits disappeared, plants became harder to find, or animals moved elsewhere, forcing people to rely on different resources. During difficult periods, foods hidden underground could become especially valuable because some roots and tubers remained available even when surface vegetation changed. Animals could also move with the seasons. Following these movements required mobility and knowledge of the landscape, linking human survival closely to the behavior of other species. Put simply, geography helped determine the menu. A community beside a river had opportunities that were very different from those of a group living on open grassland or in a colder landscape. The strongest lesson is that prehistoric diets were flexible. People combined whatever resources their surroundings could provide, adapting their choices as the environment, seasons, and circumstances changed. For a group living beside water, the river could become one of the most important parts of the local food system. Fish, aquatic animals, plants, and drinking water could all be concentrated in the same landscape. Successful fishing also required observation. Knowing where fish gathered, how water moved, and when animals were easiest to approach could make the difference between finding food and going home empty-handed. A catch did not have to be enormous to matter. Repeated small successes could gradually contribute meaningful amounts of food to a group's daily intake. The richest places were not always the largest landscapes. Shorelines and riverbanks could concentrate many different resources within a relatively small area. Survival depended not only on physical strength but also on accumulated knowledge. Skills such as finding food, recognizing plants, tracking animals, and using tools could be learned from other members of the group. Eventually, the food had to come back to the shelter. There, the group could process what they had gathered, divide resources, and prepare the next stage of the meal. Before food reached the fire, it often needed preparation. Roots could be cleaned, cut, crushed, or otherwise processed depending on their type and the technology available. Fish could require a different kind of preparation. The same basic stone technology could be adapted to cut, clean, and divide different foods obtained from the environment. Meat also had to be divided into manageable portions. Stone cutting tools made this process more practical and allowed different parts of a carcass to be used in different ways. By the end of the day, many different resources could come together in one meal. That variety is one reason the idea of a single universal prehistoric diet is so misleading. Now imagine moving the same human group into a much colder environment. The available food would change, and seasonal survival could depend much more heavily on animals and stored or preserved resources. In some cold environments, large terrestrial animals could become especially important sources of food. Their meat and fat could provide energy when many plant foods were unavailable. Seasonality could transform the food landscape. A resource that was abundant for a few weeks might disappear for months, forcing people to change their strategy. This environmental variation explains why there was never one universal prehistoric menu. Different communities had access to completely different combinations of food. Today, archaeologists try to reconstruct these diets from clues such as animal bones, stone tools, burned remains, preserved plants, teeth, and chemical signatures in ancient materials. But the archaeological record is incomplete. Animal bones and stone tools can survive for very long periods, while many plant foods decay quickly and leave much weaker traces. That means the foods we can see most clearly in archaeological sites are not necessarily the foods that made up the largest share of every ancient diet. This is why modern ideas about a single ancient diet can be misleading. Ancient people did not follow one standardized nutritional plan designed for everyone. Instead, human groups adapted. They changed where they traveled, what they collected, what they hunted, and how they processed food according to the opportunities around them. The bigger picture is surprisingly simple: ancient humans were opportunistic eaters. Their diets reflected the landscapes they lived in, the seasons they experienced, and the technologies they developed to make food usable. For thousands of generations, humans survived mainly by hunting, gathering, fishing, and adapting to whatever nature provided. Then, in some regions, people began changing their relationship with food. Instead of simply searching for wild plants, some communities gradually began cultivating useful species. This was not an overnight revolution, but a long process that unfolded differently in different parts of the world. Agriculture changed the way food was obtained. People could invest time in growing selected plants rather than relying entirely on naturally occurring resources. As cultivation became more important in some societies, people could spend more time in permanent or semi-permanent settlements. Food production was becoming a different kind of human activity. Cultivated foods could become more predictable than some wild resources, but dependence on a smaller number of crops also created new challenges and changed the balance of the diet. The transition was not simply a moment when every hunter became a farmer. For long periods, hunting, gathering, fishing, and cultivation could exist side by side. The story of food is therefore also a story about human adaptation. Changes in what people ate were connected to changes in technology, settlement, environment, and the way communities organized their lives. So when we ask what ancient humans ate, the most accurate answer is not one food or one diet. There were many ancient diets, shaped by different places, climates, seasons, and ways of life. What seems most remarkable is not that ancient humans ate one special kind of food, but how successfully they adapted to almost every environment they entered. Ancient humans did not follow a single prehistoric diet. They survived by observing their environment, learning from experience, using technology, and adapting what they ate to the world around them. That flexibility was one of the keys to human survival.